camera to work. Why the camera is not moving. I stand here, I think it can see me. Very good. Thank you. All right, so we were talking about corporate culture and leadership and whether or not, just as sort of a recap, whether or not ethics is something that is organic and sort of starts at the bottom and builds its way up. Here we go, here's a copy of the article review. I printed it off because there were several questions from students. Or it's imposed from the top down. And I suggested that it kind of depends on maybe where the life of the organization is, the size of the organization, and whether or not it's, something that is sort of a hard organization. If it's very hierarchical or flat, we'll play into that. But leadership is obviously important when we think about ethics, and corporate culture, even though it can be very difficult for a leader to change the culture. And I suggested that in the past, for example, here at UCO, that there was an attempt to sort of fundamentally change what was the culture here at UCO by one of our previous presidents. And that turns out to be really, really hard to do because of the age of the institution, the size of the institution, and sort of the unique nature and makeup of higher education. It's not something that operates like a Ford factory where people are putting tires on the Ford F-150 or putting in the engine mounts. Those are things that are easy to quantify and easy to assess whether or not people are doing those jobs, and management has a lot more control than it is to sort of analyze whether or not we are being effective in the classroom. Now, we try, right? We try to analyze, and there's more and more of a push, particularly as federal funding is attempting to regulate and monitor the outcomes that we have. And so to give people ideas as to the quality of the education that they're likely to receive and the likelihood that they will be getting jobs in their given fields. And so we put together those kinds of numbers, but it's still not one of those things that it's objectively quantifiable the way it is, where you can stand there with a stopwatch at a catfish factory and determine how many catfish are coming down the line and whether or not people are skinning and filleting those catfish in a timely manner. So it's important to think about those kinds of things. And we started talking about last time good leadership versus ethical leadership. And I asked you what was the difference. Good leadership is somebody who's effective at getting people to do things that they want them to do, whereas ethical leadership is more focused on whether or not we are actually doing the right thing. And so what you want, again, in terms of outcomes, is you want both effective leadership and leadership that is ethical. By the way, I think I forgot to mention that I did, just as sort of a synaptic misfire, I did grade your first exams. Those grades are posted. If you want to see my comments, you have to scroll down, go back into the attempt and scroll down to the bottom And they should be there, and we did look and made sure that they were there. I don't always see the interface the same way that you all see the interface, even though I can go in and do something as a student view. It's still not exactly the same when it comes to grading, but I did go in and make sure that those were there. So we started talking about, and I don't think I got much beyond contingency theory, theory X, and theory Y. And it sort of is, these are, if we think of them in terms of Hegelian dialectic, diametrically opposed theories as to whether or not people need to be micromanaged. Theory X individuals or leaders tend to view employees as someone or something that you have to constantly monitor and manage, because if you don't, employees are going to slack off and not produce. Now, again, whether or not you can do this is largely dependent on the context of the organization in which you operate. It's much easier, again, to determine in a manufacturing process whether or not you are producing the output that is necessary in order for the company to be profitable. And those kinds of metrics are easy to follow if it is an objectively repetitive sort of task. And we've gotten, for example, good at this. If you wanted to be for a long time now, I haven't seen them do this in a while, but if you wanted to be a checker at Sam's, for example, at Sam's Club, you had to be able to, they counted how fast you were scanning items. And so literally I can remember one time I thought I was being helpful at Sam's, and I went ahead and like scanned, I was loading stuff onto the belt for the person who checks out, and I scanned my card. She's like, I wish you wouldn't do that because that starts the clock and we don't have all of your items up here, and it's gonna affect my numbers. Really much harder to do with regard to whether or not you all are going to become ethical business people. We try to monitor that, and we use this course for assessment purposes in that we have a pre-test, and then we look at your pre-test and post-test scores on various instruments and see if there's a change, right? That's measured by ANOVA, analysis of variance, and a repeated measures analysis. And we look to see whether or not you have, had any shifts in your ethical ideology and in your knowledge from when you enter the class to when you leave the class. But that's just because we can measure that, doesn't mean that you're going to go out and be ethical. How would we monitor that? And what's the decay effect of that knowledge? How quickly does it leave or you change? Studies suggest, for example, that at this point in your development, that lots regarding your personality is already sort of set and not going to change very much. But we still try. So theory X suggests that people need to be monitored and they need to be heavily micromanaged because they're inherently lazy. And if we don't do that, it's likely that they'll get off on their own and not really produce. Theory Y, on the other hand, says that we find our greatest fulfillment in what we do. And this is evidenced by the fact that one of the first questions that people will ask you, and I tell my students, sales students in particular, when we have a sales competition, one of the first questions that anybody will ask you is, what do you do for a living? And they ask you that for a number of reasons. One is it's an easy way to sort of pick up on where you are on the social hierarchy. We like to believe, and part of our mythology in this country is that we don't have a class system like they do in Great Britain, where they have a entitled, ennobled aristocracy with the monarchy at the head of that, right? And how did King Charles, we now have a king, the longest reigning monarch in British history was Queen Elizabeth II. She died a couple of years ago and her son took over. He's been the heir in waiting for most of his life. I don't believe that his reign is going to last nearly as long as hers because he's already like old. He's in his 70s. And so, you know, how long can he? She took over when she was 24 years old. And so we like to believe in this country that when we jettisoned the English monarchy, that we jettisoned that class system. But there was a guy who wrote a book called Class, and he says that we have a distinct class system in the United States. Now, in some ways, it's more fair in that class is not dictated so much by who you were born to, but by how much money you make. And he sort of details this in the book. I think his name is Paul Fussell, who wrote the book on class. And it's an interesting read if you're interested in that kind of thing. And he details in that book how the super rich out of sight have a lot in common with the what he calls, I think he uses the term subterranean poor, and how the two ends of the spectrum actually have an enormous amount in common. They both don't like authority. They don't like the police, for example. They try to hide or stay out of the spotlight. He uses the White House as an example of a horribly middle-class home because it's right out there for everybody to see. You can walk by it if you've been to Washington, D.C. It's clearly right there. And it's only the middle classes, according to him, that want people to notice them and to, sort of notice that they have arrived in this status. The White House is sort of the ultimate in the American political class system of you've arrived, right? You've got this house that has all the trappings of the office of the presidency. So theory Y, if we look at this, says that we find a lot of satisfaction in our jobs. We ask people what they do. That's a good way of pegging you on sort of the social class ladder. It's also a way of breaking the ice.
Okay, it's been quite a lot.
I don't know why it's doing this. My phone is going crazy. I just tapped it to see what time it is, and it starts playing YouTube videos automatically. It should have been playing my YouTube video. And we asked this question, and according to sociologists, a lot of us find enormous satisfaction and creativity in our work. How I communicate with you, I find to be an enormously creative process. If you've been to my office, you will notice that I have an enormous amount of original oil paintings. My mother owned an art gallery in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I love art. I wish I could paint. My mother was a fantastic artist. She not only owned an art gallery, but she was very good at painting things. And people actually commissioned her to paint various pieces, even to paint sort of knockoffs of famous works of art. One of her friends commissioned her to paint a painting that was, I believe, Matisse, called Woman in a Purple Coat. And she did that for him. And when he passed away, he gave it back to us, to our family. And it's in my office now that she did. It's a rather large painting. The original is in the university or the Museum of Fine Art in Houston, I believe. So I can't paint. Again, lots of people in my family play instruments. I'm not good at that. I like karaoke, but I'm sort of horrific at it. If there's a karaoke machine within 50 miles, I'm gonna go do that. And I've got videos up if you want a good laugh. You can look at my videos on YouTube of me singing karaoke. It's probably a horrific experience. All my friends just hate it when I see that there's a karaoke machine. And, so I don't have any talent. And so my creative outlet is largely this job. How do I reach you and get you interested in topics that are kind of dry and boring, that involve discussion of really hard ideas? How do I do that? When I was in my 20s and I started teaching at the collegiate level, I was 22. And when I started, it was a lot easier because I was younger than most of my students, and that's sort of novel. And it was easier to reach them. I knew what they were interested in. Now, I don't connect with you the way I did when I was in my 20s. It's harder for me to figure out what it is because as you go through life, things change. The things that I am interested in doing at 51 are far different than the things I was interested in my 20s, which was largely going out and having a good time. And so it's harder for me. So my creative outlet is trying to figure out ways to reach you and ensure that you get the information that I need you to get so that we can attempt, even though it's unclear to me as to whether or not we have much success in doing this, attempt to make you better and more ethical marketers. And as marketers, you have an enormous amount of power to persuade people. There are ethicists who argue that marketing is no longer satisfying needs and wants. We're creating irrational needs and desires in people. Do you need an iPhone? It's amazing what good marketers Apple is with regard to this device, particularly among, I think I asked in here how many of you had an iPhone, and a lot of you raised your hand. With regard to this device, most people of your generation or your age have this device, and you want to know one of the reasons that they want this device? Young kids, their parents want them to have a phone because it's a safety thing. You know where your kid is. And they're like, I read this article about how a lot of parents are saying, you break things, you're hard on them. Why don't we get you something other than an iPhone? And young people will put up with an older generation phone in order to have an iPhone because they don't want to be the green bubble in a text chat. Who is not using an iPhone if you have an iPhone, and all their friends have iPhones, and they don't want to be the green text box. Isn't that completely irrational? My friend who's in IT insists that the Android is a much better phone, a much better platform. I don't know. They do not make ForeFlight for Droids. Just can't get it. So the software that I use to do flight planning, you have to have an Apple device. Will not work on a non-Apple device at this point. I don't know if they're ever going to come out with a app for it. And he insists that it's a much better device. I don't know. It's much more customizable. But students in the United States mostly want an iPhone. They do not want their friends. It's a status symbol. And it's sort of maybe an irrational desire that we have created here. And so as marketers, you have enormous power to influence. If you can come up with really creative ways of reaching people, you can influence them. And shouldn't we think about the implications of that? Yes, we should. And it's the reason why most of you are in this class, because when we ask people what's the most important thing to them about a job, money, until you get to one type of person, money is not the first thing that people say. It's usually like fifth or sixth on surveys until you talk to salespeople. And salespeople, it's the number one motivation for going into sales. But everybody else, they go into their work because they find meaning in it. They find value in doing these things. And so according to Theory Y, what you need to do is you need to let people, because we are meaning generating beings and we find value, I find it a lot of value in my work. I am very creative in the research process that I go through to publish papers, because we have to publish as part of our job. We're evaluated on three things as college professors: research, teaching, and service. And so I find an enormous amount of satisfaction in these activities. And it's the way I am creative. Now, so if we think of this in terms of thesis, antithesis, so you've got the thesis, which is people are inherently lazy. The antithesis is that people inherently find meaning and value. Is there a synthesis model between theory X and theory Y? So the way the Hegelian dialectic works is you have a thesis, and if the thesis stays around long enough, you get an antithesis to the thesis, and then that becomes its own thesis, and then out of these two, you get a synthesis. Is there a synthesis model? Yes.
Said that people work because they want something out of it. Like
Okay,
something-
that's a transactional, you can have a duck. That's a transactional relationship. I think you would find that as more closely related to theory X, in that theory X would say people work because it's purely transactional, and the minute that you allow them any sort of latitude or freedom, they're going to take their foot off the gas pedal, so to speak, and do what they want to do because they're sort of inherently lazy. I guess I would say that I think the synthesis model is that it largely is predicated on the type of work that you are discussing. So when I was vice mayor 25 years ago in the great city of Guthrie, Oklahoma, we actually employed the waste collectors, the trash men. And I think I've talked about this before in this class. I don't know anybody who says it's my dream to be a trash collector. Although after reading essays, maybe I do want to do that. It's not a bad job anymore. You don't actually have to get dirty anymore. You ride around in a truck and you stick the arm out to grab the container, the big blue container, and then you dump it, and then the truck does almost everything for you at this point. It's not that bad a job. In the past, 25 years ago, they actually had to pick up, it was a 3-man crew. So the trash truck would go through the neighborhood. There would be 2 men. The prime job in that 3-man crew was to be the driver, because the driver just drove, and they would kind of drive down the center of the street. 2 men would jump off and they would grab trash cans and dump it into the back of the trash truck. It's not the way it works anymore. They've got one person, grab it, dump it, go. Ride around, and it's not that bad of a job anymore. One of my constituents, I think I told you this story before, was actually when I was on city council 25 years ago, was actually one of our trash collectors. If you asked him how he defined his life, he didn't talk about his job. He defined himself by the activities that he liked outside of the job, which were things like fishing and hunting and camping with his family. Those were the things that he enjoyed the most. So if you've got that kind of job, yeah, I don't think people find an enormous amount of benefit or creativity in that kind of, and you don't want them getting creative in that job. Again, the McDonald's example that I think I talked about last time, you don't want somebody deciding that the Big Mac is something other than 2 all-beef patty, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. You don't want them getting creative in this process. Because if they do, your product is not consistent, right? So I think it largely depends. I think the synthesis model would be that it depends on the kind of work that you're doing. Yes, you have to have, by its very nature, when you're dealing with college professors, you have to have an enormous amount of discretion in allowing people to teach the way they are going to teach, because they're the subject matter expert. Even within marketing, within the marketing department, my expertise lies and my research lies in this topic on ethics and marketing. That's where my dissertation focus was on ethics and marketing. There is nobody else in the department that really understands this stuff to the level and extent that I do. And I don't understand logistics to the extent that Dr. Ginshev, who teaches our logistics courses, understands it. And so I can visit classes when I do evaluations for peers and say, yeah, he seems to have enthusiasm, the students seem to respond to him, but I don't know in depth the things that he's talking about the way he does, and he doesn't know in depth the way I do about ethics. And so it really sort of depends. Some organizations lend themselves, I think the synthesis model is that you can't say this is the right fit for every organization at every place and every time. This is like the Aristotelian approach to politics. In Republic, what we end up with Socrates and Plato is they say this is the best form of government. It's a republican form of government. And what do they mean by republican form of government? What did the ancients mean when they said republic? They did not mean what political scientists say a republic is today. Republicanism today is defined as representative democracy. That's not what the ancients meant. They meant a form of government that had elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, or polity as they called it, right? And Aristotle looks at that and says, no, like there isn't one. He studies 250 Greek polis, city-states, and says there isn't one best form that's going to fit all people at all places at all times. We've done this. The British did this. When they left sub-Saharan Africa, they tried to impose their ideas of representative democracy on the peoples of those countries. And it didn't work. They wrote constitutions. They held elections, and it was largely a failure. Why? Because in order to have representative democracy, in order to have people that vote, you have to have behavioral requirements of citizens. What are those behavioral requirements? You have to have a high literacy rate, right? Voting requires some level of literacy. You go into the voting booth and you have to be able to do what? Read. Now, technically you don't in the United States. You can have somebody go with you. You can say I'm low vision. I need this person to go with me. And so you can do that. But by and large, on the whole, you have to be able to read and write because you have to sign your name in the book, right? So there are behavioral requirements of citizens if you're going to have a representative democracy. If you have large portions of your population that cannot read or write, the chances of your democracy surviving are not good. And so Aristotle says, look, there's not one form of government. I don't think there's one form of leadership that's right for all organizations at all places at all times. You can't get real creative with McDonald's. You have to be real creative at the University of Central Oklahoma in order to reach students, in order, one of the reasons I do the duck hunt is that's one way, it gives me an easy way of keeping track of how much you participated rather than just sort of guessing at the end. I can count ducks, but it's also kind of novel. Like students are kind of fascinated. It's amazing how many people actually ask me if they can keep a duck at the end of the class. They want to know if they can have a duck. So it requires some creativity. Dialogic leadership is employee-centered. It's one that believes that you should focus on the employees. Again, this kind of leadership probably works in places like UCO, where we have an enormous amount of workforce democracy. We have something called the Faculty Senate. And if they want to make major changes in policy, those at least have to go through the Faculty Senate and be considered before they can be implemented. That is completely different from Ford, where they can impose differences in policy the next day. Their president can say, we're going to a 10-hour, 4-day-a-week work week for all shifts, and do that. And carry it out, where everybody gets basically a 3-day weekend. There are businesses that are now doing this. UCO does this during the summer. We have a shortened work week. We're closed on Friday afternoons. So if you're an hourly employee here, you have to make up the time somehow. How you do that is up to you, but you have to make up the time somehow. These two types of leadership, charismatic and transformational, are really, really close. And what's the difference? Anybody know what charismatic leadership is and an example of charismatic leadership? What does it mean when we say you have charisma? Yes.
Like you're very influential, like in the way you act, like people can believe you easily kind of.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, based off that, I'd say a good example would be I don't know, Hitler.
Yeah, that's the classic example. You get a duck. That is the classic example. What were you gonna say? You forgot? Yeah, the classic example of charismatic leadership. Now, I don't get it. You watch speeches of Hitler in the past, and I think it's almost comical, but you have to remember that people weren't exposed to the level of sophistication in terms of communication that we have today. So he did this thing. There was a pattern to his speeches. It started out, and when he started out in the sort of beer halls talking, it starts out, he's kind of low, and it builds and builds and builds until he's basically screaming and flailing his arms. That doesn't work real well on television. I have to watch my videos from time to time, and I have to think about the way I am portraying my actions on YouTube, because television and video in particular are what we can call cool mediums, in that I have a tendency to be pretty expressive in my hand gestures. When I'm talking, I talk with my hands. A lot of people do this. And on television and in video, that doesn't come across as well as it does in real life. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why I think Hitler, if you look at the videos of him, it just doesn't, it comes across as comical to me, because he's pounding his fists on the podium and raising his hand up and making very erratic gestures. And in a video, it doesn't work. It does work in person much better. It was one of the reasons why when I used to help run political campaigns, that I think David Walters won his campaign for governor, because he came across, he was the most unanimated man I've ever seen. When we had him go out and talk to crowds in small towns, he would put them to sleep, but people loved watching him on television because he wasn't very animated. I can remember we held a big fundraiser for him in Guthrie in a building that my mother managed called the Victor Mall. It's still there. You can go to downtown Guthrie. It's now been turned into a bed and breakfast. But my mom was the manager. She was the receiver for the Bank of Oklahoma, which had foreclosed on that building. And we held this fundraiser for David Walters. And my best friend, who later became my boss and then was on city council with me, and then later in life became my law partner, would get up and give him what he referred to as an old Ben Milam speech. And that's, who will ride with old Ben Milam to save the honor of Texas? And so he would give this speech, and he would get people sort of like riled up and clapping and all enthusiastic about supporting David Walters. And then Walters would get up and kind of put people to sleep because he wasn't energetic and he wasn't, but on television, which by that point in time, the way you get elected, at that point in time, the way you got elected and the way you reached people was largely through television, because that was the dominant medium at the time for getting votes. To reach people was to get on television. He did really, really well because he didn't look like he was going to come unhinged and fly off the handle. We also worked for a candidate named Lori Williams when she ran for Congress. And I remember watching it on television, her debate with Ernest Istook, and she looked patently crazy. Whereas Istook looked normal because she had all of these odd sort of gestures, and on television, it just didn't work very well. But yeah, Hitler is the classic example of charismatic leadership. He's also an example of effective leadership, right? I mean, he was highly effective at getting an entire nation behind him to go to war on anything that anyone who knew anything about going to war would have said, you're nuts. You cannot go to war on two fronts. It's crazy. Can't be done at that point in time. Not going to work out well. We tried in the United States a war on two fronts. Didn't work out well. What do I mean? Recently, we tried this. We went after 9/11, which most of you are too young to actually remember. We went to war in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Did we win those wars? No, we didn't. We didn't win them. Really hard to do. Probably really hard to do anyway, with one. If you'd just gone into Afghanistan. The minute we pulled out of Afghanistan, who took back over? The Taliban. You can have a doctor for, no, I mean, it's the Taliban. The minute we pulled out, the Taliban came back. Transformational leadership looks a lot like charismatic because people who are transformational oftentimes have a lot of presence. They're good at communicating with other people. They're good at motivating people. Charismatic leaders are good at motivating people. Theory X relies completely on actual power. The formal tools of power. I have some formal tools of power as the professor in this classroom. I would venture to guess that none of you really want to take a test. I don't know anybody who says, I just yearn to take tests. I love them. Please, add some more in. Don't know anybody who says that. But you're going to take tests. Why? Because I have some formal power in that you want something, which is a grade so that you can graduate and get a job in marketing and make a lot of money. charismatic leaders, while they may have formal tools of power, their informal persuasion methods are generally much greater than the formal tools of power. People can have very limited formal powers and still get an enormous amount accomplished if they are capable of motivating people. What do I mean by that? We have in Oklahoma City a council manager form of government, which is the same form of government that we have in Guthrie. Now, most big cities, by the way, don't have this form of government because it's horribly unresponsive. And in fact, in Dallas, the mayor who is elected, they have a council manager form of government in Dallas, and the mayor and the city manager have in the recent past, been at war with each other. But because the city manager could count votes and knew that the mayor didn't have the votes, he basically stopped returning the mayor's phone call. He was ignoring the mayor, and there wasn't anything you could do. Now, the mayor of Dallas is actually elected by more people than most governors. He's elected by more people than most United States senators. And yet he couldn't get anything done because the mayor's powers in that kind of government are very limited. They don't have an enormous amount of formal power. So how do you get things done? Well, you have to use sort of charismatic or transformational leadership in order to get people to do what you want them to do. As vice mayor in the great city of Guthrie, Oklahoma, I have to get 3 other councilmen to go along with me if I want to do anything. I can't make anything happen without 3 other people. Now, you have to be very careful in how you do that. Because if you're meeting together outside of a council meeting and polling your fellow council, that's a violation of the Open Meeting Act. So you have to do this in the public's eye, and that can be very difficult to do. It means that you have to rely on an ability to persuade and make arguments in public meetings that resonate with your fellow council people. And that's where transformational leadership is helpful. And it's the sort of positive, most people focus on charismatic leadership in sort of a pejorative way. Transformational leadership, you see a lot of the same characteristics, but these are people who want to elevate you to a higher level, or they have some good goal in mind.
So then would like an example of transformational leadership be like Nelson Mandela?
Yes, I think that's right.
Okay.
Yes, I think that you can have a duck, by the way, for asking the plan. Yes, Nelson Mandela was a transformational leader. He fought for the equality of his people in a system that was horribly repressive, and ultimately became president of that nation, of South Africa, right? When I was a kid growing up, South Africa had a separate but equal, they called it apartheid system, a de jure system of segregation, as opposed to de facto. De jure means by law. So there were all of these laws in South Africa that formally categorized people based on an arbitrary and capricious factor as to whether, what kind of rights they had, as opposed to de facto. Now, a lot of people argue that you still have de facto segregation in places like South Africa, and that we still have de facto segregation in the United States. How do we have de facto segregation in the United States? Well, you have groups of people that are underrepresented in lots of professions because of historic barriers to entry in the US. Even some of the things that we thought would cure this and make it more objective, things like the credit score. The credit score was supposed to be a way of objectively determining whether or not people were credit worthy, and it instituted a de facto form of segregation, basically. So you can have de facto or de jure. In South Africa, they had apartheid that was de jure. Now, do they still have some de facto? I think so. You have a small, they didn't nationalize, when Nelson Mandela came to power, they didn't nationalize all of the non-African property rights, right? They didn't do that. So transformational leadership, a lot of times is ones that want to raise people, and it doesn't rely on the formalistic characteristics of power, the flow chart. So if you look at a flow chart, for example, you would think that professors, I mean, the University of Central Oklahoma is a hierarchical organization where you have, a president who's the CEO up here, and then below the president, you have vice presidents, so you have administration, you have academic affairs, you have student services, right? Then you have the foundation. Under them, you have more people, directors level, until you get down to the bottom and you have a whole lot of little boxes right here. And under those, professors are at the end of this box. But we actually have an enormous amount of formal power in that we can elect people to the faculty senate, and they can represent us, and things have to go through the faculty senate for things like that. But transformational leadership relies less on those formal types of power and more on the informal types of power. Paternalistic leadership, this is the strong father model, is what I think of it as. Paternalistic leadership focuses on whether or not, the leader it's maybe what we call a benign dictatorship model. They view their subordinates as, needing a lot of help, and sort of a strong father model. This was very, very common in the United States in the 1950s. Lots of organizations operated this way. And we had television shows that highlighted this and sort of reinforced it. What were some of those television shows? Leave It to Beaver, right? Father knows best kind of shows. My Three Sons. Pragmatic leadership is often seen by, in my opinion, by people who become leaders sort of out of necessity, right? So not only is it important what kind of organization you have, but also how you become a leader within the organization is going to determine sort of what kind of leadership you have. Transformational leaders and charismatic leaders are people who oftentimes seek out those kinds of roles. Pragmatic leaders are oftentimes people who are thrust into those kinds of roles because they sort of were the last man standing. At the university, I have a friend who literally missed a department meeting, I think, and became department chair because nobody else wanted to do it. And they're like, well, he's not here. Let's vote for him. So it's an incrementalist type approach to leadership. Then you have caring leadership. What is caring leadership? This is leadership that in many instances has similarities, and a lot of these are not necessarily mutually inclusive or exclusive categories. You can have leaders that are transformational that are also caring. They care, they want their followers to achieve their best selves. And that's obviously caring about them. Yeah.
Would an example of that be like a sports coach?
Yeah, I think that would be a good example you could have done. Sports coaches are oftentimes, depending on the type of sport, and I mean, you have those coaches that yell and scream and threaten, and use theory X kind of motivations. But then you have coaches that really want to help you become a better athlete, right? And they care about who you are. If you think about the movie, how many of you say it's a rather old movie now with Tom Cruise called Jerry Maguire? Anybody seen that movie? He starts out, he's a sports agent, and he starts out as just, it's about you're the toughest, you're the best, you got to get out there. If you have a head injury, he shows up at one of his players' hospital rooms, and the guy has had a concussion. And we now know a lot more than even when that movie was made about the negative impacts that head injuries can have. And by the way, I didn't know this until my niece started playing soccer. My brother played soccer in high school. Then he went into tennis because he thought he could get a scholarship, and he did get a scholarship for that. He was very successful at that. But I didn't realize that soccer has just as many head injuries as football. Did you know that? And I was watching this game. My niece plays soccer, and she's on this elite team. And when she was a little kid, like, there's no elite team when you're little kids, right? They're all just kind of a mess. They just all kind of run around, and it's very disorganized. And there was this one girl who had a really big head. And every game she'd get a ball to the head and she'd topple over. And I mean, it was frightening for me to watch. And her parents were like, yeah, she's fine. I'm like, really? That's your attitude? I mean, and then I started reading about this. There are just as many head injuries, and it's because you get a ball to the head. And you're not wearing any, in soccer, protective headgear for that, like you do in football, where they know that there's going to be, head-on collisions on the field, right? So caring leadership would be those people that, actually coach because they want you to be better, they care about you, they have some kind of, and again, you could have paternalistic leaders that are also caring. That, I've got to take care of you. And so you can see that there are some overlaps. A lot of times you'll have transformational leaders that are also caring leaders, right? So you can see these are not necessarily clearly defined categories. I suppose you could have a charismatic leader who is sort of benign. That you could have somebody who is charismatic that's not really all that interested in taking people to the next level, but is interested in sort of the pomp and circumstance of the position and motivating people to do what they want, and is not necessarily in it for all the wrong reasons. Any questions about leadership and ethics? Well, how do we build a values-based culture that employs good values? Again, when we talk about culture, organizations that have strong cultures generally do better than organizations that don't have strong cultures. There are a number of institutions in the state of Oklahoma. We have an extraordinary number of universities in this state compared to some other states for the size of population. I mean, how many just state institutions do we have in Oklahoma? Well, we have the two big flagship universities, one in Stillwater, one in Norman. That's OU and OSU, and they have multiple campuses throughout the state. So OU also has a campus in Tulsa. OSU has a campus in Tulsa. Then we have Cameron University, that's part of, I believe, the OU Board of Regents. The agricultural and mechanical schools fall under the OSU Board of Regents. So Langston University, which is not very far from my hometown, Guthrie, is an ag school. They have the Kika de la Garza Goat Research Center there. So they're an ag school. They fall under the OSU Board of Regents. Panhandle State, I believe, falls under the OSU Board of Regents because they're an agricultural school. Then we have the schools that are under the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges, which thinks its name is Rousseau, but according to our Constitution, they're the Board of Regents of Oklahoma Colleges. So that is Northwestern Oklahoma State, Southeastern, Northeastern, University of Central Oklahoma, Southwestern, I think that's it, and Weatherford, that's SWOSU. I think that's all that we have under those. So we have a lot of regional universities and a lot of other institutions of higher education. If you go into the community college, or what are now called, they're community colleges or junior colleges, what they've historically been called. So the 2-year schools like OCCC, Redlands Community College, Rose State College, and we have so many of them, and there are so many that have duplicative programs that you sort of wonder about some of them's mission. And whether or not they articulate that mission well. So we want organizations that have a clear mission statement, that know who they are. So building a value-based culture, we want them to have a clear mission statement. And unlike Philip Morris, which has clear mission statements, we want those mission statements as ethicists to be reflective of something that's positive. It involves having a code of ethics for your organization. How do you develop these codes? What goes into the code of ethics? If we look, for example, at my profession has an entirely long list of codes. So if we go to, for example, the legal profession is regulated under Title V of the Oklahoma statute. And then you scroll down and there are a ton of laws and regulations that govern the legal profession, called the Rules of Professional Conduct, right? They start in Appendix 3A of Title V, and they govern all aspects of the legal profession. Everything from how much I can charge to communicating with clients and things like that is governed by the Rules of Professional Responsibility. Most organizations don't need this detailed level of a code of ethics. Why does the legal profession need this level of detail? Like we've got, conflicts of interest with current clients, conflicts of interest with current client-specific rules, duties to former clients. If you were ever my client, do I have a duty to you? People do this because they know, particularly very wealthy people, they know that lawyers have a prohibition against conflict of interest. So when they start to get a divorce from their spouse, they'll go and talk to every good lawyer in a town so that they can try and bar their spouse basically from being able to hire the best lawyers in town. It doesn't work, by the way, but they try to do these kinds of things. Do we need this kind of detail level? I don't think you do for most organizations, but it is important to have some kind of code. How do you develop that code is also enormously important. It's not just what you have in that code, but what kind of theory are you basing that code on? So if we look at the code of ethics for lawyers, for example, fees. What kinds of consideration do we see going into, and if we click on, for example, fees, a lawyer shall not make an agreement for a charge or collect an unreasonable fee or unreasonable amount for expenses. The factors to be considered in determining the reasonableness of a fee include the following: the time and labor required, the novelty and difficulty of the questions involved, the skill requisite to perform the legal service properly, the likelihood, if apparent to the client, that the acceptance of the particular employment will preclude the employment by the lawyer of other clients, the fee customarily charged in local or similar legal services, the amount involved and the results obtained, the time limitations imposed by the client or the circumstances, the nature and length of the professional relationship with the client, the experience, reputation, and ability of the lawyer or lawyers performing the services, and whether the fee is fixed or contingent. So let's look at just a couple of these. The lawyer shall not charge an unreasonable fee or an unreasonable amount of expenses. And the factors to be considered are the time and the labor required, the novelty and difficulty of the questions involved. What theory is used to justify that? Or what theories could you use to justify that prohibition against unreasonable fees? What? You think it's duty ethics? Why do you think it's duty ethics?
You have a duty to provide service and not
Okay,
cheat, I
you
guess.
can make a duty ethics argument that this is, it is an a priori duty to not cheat your client. You can also make a utilitarian argument for this, right? In that if you are charging exorbitant fees and lawyers do this, and if all of them did, you deny access to justice for people. You are in effect denying them access to justice. So these codes, don't have to be this detailed in most organizations, but it's important to think about what it is that we're putting in these codes and how we arrive at those kinds of codes. If you are a publicly traded company, these are mandatory. Most organizations should have them, most don't if they're particularly small to mid-sized organizations. But if you are a publicly traded company, as a result of corporate scandals like Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, the subprime mortgage industry scandals, you're now regulated and required to have them and have an ethics officer. Statements of values that organizations develop. These are enormously important. But you cannot just develop these and then put them in a shelf and forget about them. It's like developing, so you all are going to, if you haven't taken it yet, has anybody taken marketing management? A couple of you. In that class, what do you have to do? What's the end thing that you have to do in that class?
Big paper.
Yeah, but it's a specific type of paper. It's not a research paper per se, is it?
To develop a marketing
You have to develop a marketing plan, right? And the last time I checked, the professor who teaches that course picks the company for you that you're going to develop the marketing plan. And
UCO.
what?
This last summer, it was UCO.
It was UCO. So you're going to develop a marketing plan. Well, what is a marketing plan? Well, it's a outline of how you're going to be a successful organization from a marketing standpoint. Right? How you're going to, and again, marketing is the only fully integrated function of the firm. And so it's important that we develop these plans in order to create successful companies. Now, having a good marketing plan does not mean that you will automatically be successful, right? There are lots of companies that go broke even though they develop marketing plans. A lot of companies go broke because they don't develop really good marketing plans. They don't really think about the way things are going to go. My mother was exceptionally good at developing marketing plans. She was a serial entrepreneur. And she developed a marketing plan when we came over here, and she started this business in Guthrie, Oklahoma, the Stone Line Inn, the first bed and breakfast in the state. And we almost went broke in spite of the fact that she developed a really solid marketing plan that she took to the bank to get the loan to start that company. And the reason was that one of the things that she just didn't even think about, hadn't occurred to us, was that we were the first bed and breakfast in Oklahoma. We didn't think, we knew we were gonna be the first bed and breakfast in Guthrie, didn't think that we were gonna be the first bed and breakfast in Oklahoma. And Oklahomans did not have a lot of familiarity with bed and breakfast, and they did not know what a bed and breakfast was. We thought we'd been going back and forth to Northwest Arkansas to visit her best friend, who we called Aunt Jane. And her best friend had been married a doctor, and as a wedding gift, he bought her a bed and breakfast in Yaleville, Arkansas, which is in the Ozarks of Arkansas on this river. And they did float trips and things like that. And there were lots of bed and breakfasts all over Arkansas. And we thought Oklahoma and Arkansas are very similar to each other. And so surely Oklahomans would understand what a bed and breakfast. No, they had no concept of what a bed and breakfast was. They showed up and they'd say, "This is your house." And my mother would say, "Yes, that's what a bed and breakfast is. You're staying in my lovely old," I don't want to stay in your house. And so she had to pivot and figure out a way to make this business work, and she did. So it's great to come up with the plans, but it's great to come up with a plan of being an ethical culture, but you also have to monitor those and figure out if you need to change things. How do you do that? Well, through, in large organizations, ethics hotlines. Having a place where people can call and make formal complaints about, ethical breaches. Having a corporate ethics officer and having that person, actually, you can tell whether or not they're important by whether or not they're part of the executive committee. That they're in on the major decisions, or are you just combining it? A lot of companies just do this. And the company that I worked for, the American Education Corporation, we were an educational software publisher and a publicly traded company, so we had to have one, and they just made me the ethics officer. Well, there's a problem with that. As an ethics officer, you're supposed to be the one who, tells the company and the board of directors, maybe, you've got a problem. But because I was chief general counsel, what was my job? Well, it was to protect the company. Could you see how that would be a conflict of interest? Your job as a lawyer is to protect your client. Now, again, if we go to the rules of professional conduct, lawyers also have other duties, look at some of these other duties that you have. Candor towards the tribunal, right? So as an advocate, if you look at Rule 3.3, candor towards the tribunal. As a lawyer, I can't, even though I want to vigorously defend my client, I can't lie to the court or whatever the tribunal is. If it's a binding arbitration, you can't lie to the arbitrator. Fairness to opposing parties in counsel. So even though you want to vigorously defend and advocate for your client, you have a duty to be fair. But outside of these very limited types of things, a lawyer's job is to protect their client. And so it's probably not a great thing, which a lot of companies have tried to do, to use your lawyer, because they think, well, lawyers know all about the rules. They operate under detailed rules of professional responsibility. We'll just make the lawyer the ethics officer. The lawyer's job is fundamentally to represent the institution and make sure that the institution is protected from lawsuits. So maybe it's not a good idea to have the lawyer be the ethics officer. And then how do you integrate this into a holistic approach? Matters. How do you do this? Again, it's like the marketing. So you guys have done marketing management, have done a marketing plan. You can have a fantastic marketing plan, and if then what you do is you put that marketing plan in a drawer and do nothing with it, it's a worthless document. You can develop a fantastic code of ethics, and if you put it on the top shelf, it's a worthless document. It involves actually integrating that. How do you do that? Well, most companies, you start by doing it at your employee orientation and training. So when you're hired into a new job, lots of organizations have training periods where they go over all of this with you. But even that is not enough to just go over it once and say, how many of you like The Office? My nephew loves The Office. How many of you like The Office? A few of you. All right. How many of you remember? How many of you remember the episode called Ethics Training? Anybody remember that episode?
I think I know that episode where they had the sticky notes on their heads.
Uh,
But a different one.
I don't remember if they had sticky notes on their heads, but in the episode, it's revealed. So the HR person is supposed to do ethics training with the employees at the branch office. If I get this wrong, correct me. The branch office of Dunder Mifflin that's in Scranton, Pennsylvania, is that where they're supposed to be? Is that right? I never watched The Office. My nephew, when he was 7 years old, fell in love with The Office. And I don't get it, because it's one of those things that most 7-year-olds would not get the humor of The Office. It's kind of incredible that he did. But my nephew's kind of an odd character anyway. When he was 8, I asked him and his sister if they wanted to go with me to a bookstore in South Dallas that's called The Wild Detectives. And his sister just kind of threw a fit and didn't want to go, and she was being difficult. She's often that way. And we get in the car, and my nephew says, he's 8 years old, and he says, well, you know, Grant, he never called me Uncle Grant, I don't think ever. It's just, you know, Grant, Ella's a very difficult child. And I said, why do you say that, Carson? He said, I can give you a substantive example. At 8 years old, he says, I can give you a substantive example. And I said, okay, Carson, what's your substantive example? And he says, do you remember that dollhouse that you painstakingly put together for Christmas one year? Because Dad didn't want to do it. They always I hate putting stuff together, but my brother refuses to read instructions. And so it always ends up like he just hands it to me and I end up putting this stuff together. And so I put together this dollhouse. It was fairly complex. And my nephew said, I said, yeah, Carson, I remember that. He said, well, do you know what happened to that dollhouse? I said, I have no idea, Carson. It's obviously not in Elle's room. What happened to it? He said, well, she took it over to Mom's house, but she never played with it. And she had this friend who was playing with it a lot. And my mom said, hey, Elle, we're going to redo your room. Why don't we give this dollhouse that you don't play with very much to your friend Ella? And she said, well, what are you going to get for it? And Mom said, Carson says, Mom said, well, Elle, she doesn't have, her family doesn't have as much money. Why don't we just give it to her? And my nephew says, you could just see a piece of her cold, dark soul die at that. So he loves The Office, and the ethics training episode, they have a new HR person, and this one, the character that Steve Carell's, I've gone blank on the name, actually likes this HR person. He didn't like the other one whose name was Toby, I think, if I recall, right? He hated Toby. He likes the new one. And so he's trying to help her out, and they're just not getting very far in the ethics training. And she's just going over basically rules. And one of the characters says, that's not ethics. Ethics is a discussion of the good, right? What you're doing is you're just going over company policy on you don't steal pencils from the company. He said that's just a anti-theft policy. And so Michael is trying to get them talking about the good. And he's like, well, immunity day, we'll just give you immunity. And he asked for volunteers to describe, and Meredith, has this huge, if you haven't seen this episode, has this huge lapse in ethics, right? I mean, it's kind of funny, but Michael's given her immunity. And then watch the episode and see what happens at the end, right? I mean, it's really kind of funny. It's not just about going over these rules once and then ignoring it. It's about actually having to monitor this and keep track. All right, I'm out of time, so it's a good thing I got through the end of that. And next time we will march on. If you got ducks today, come see me. Let me turn off the live stream.